The penthouse apartment was silent, bathed in the glow of city lights flickering through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of San Francisco at night was breathtaking. The Golden Gate Bridge bathed in fog, and the bustling streets far below, alive with the pulse of the city. But within the walls of the apartment, there was an eerie stillness. Diane Malone, 50, stood by the window, her back straight and her posture poised, but the lines on her face betrayed her inner turmoil. She was a striking woman, tall, with sharp, angular features that spoke of her high-powered career in real estate. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, styled meticulously as if she were still in control, despite the chaos brewing inside her. The light from the city reflected off the diamonds in her earrings, but it couldn't hide the anxiety in her hazel eyes. Her expensive red silk dress clung to her figure, but tonight, even the luxury of her appearance couldn't make her feel at ease. Evelyn Wells, 62, sat on the edge of a plush velvet armchair, gripping a glass of wine that she sipped occasionally, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Her once beautiful face had softened with age, her dark brown hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still held a sharp intelligence. She had spent years at the top of the corporate world as a CEO, a formidable woman who had built her wealth from nothing. She wore a black velvet gown, a contrast to Diane's fiery red, and there was a certain elegance about her that hadn't diminished with time. But as she sat there, her mind raced, a storm of thoughts that couldn't settle. Both women had been intertwined in Ryan's life for months, bound by their shared obsession with him. The 20-year-old man, with his boyish good looks, charm, and mysterious allure, had turned their worlds upside down. They had thought they could control him, use him to fulfill their desires. Instead, he had played them, manipulated them, and drawn them into a tangled web of lies and deceit. Now, standing in the center of the room, Ryan, a tall, athletic young man with short, messy brown hair and bright green eyes that seemed to gleam with hidden motives, fidgeted nervously, his face an unreadable mask. His youthfulness made him look almost innocent, but beneath the surface, he was anything but. His lean body was clad in a tailored black suit that seemed out of place in the tension of the moment. His gaze flickered between the two women, both of whom had learned about each other's affair with him. The weight of their jealousy, suspicion, and desire for revenge hung in the air, thick enough to suffocate. "So what now?" Ryan asked, his voice cool, almost too calm for the situation. He was used to manipulation, to control, but tonight something felt different. There was an edge to the atmosphere that made his stomach tighten. Evelyn set her glass down on the polished coffee table with a soft clink, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You thought you could have both of us, didn't you?" she said, her voice low, dripping with disdain. "You used us, Ryan, played us against each other like fools." Diane, her fists clenched at her sides, turned to face him, her lips curling into a tight smile. "I should have known better than to trust someone like you," she said, her tone venomous. "You were nothing but a game to you, weren't you?" Ryan didn't flinch. "I never promised anything. You both knew what this was from the start." His eyes flickered toward the door, as if contemplating an escape. But there was no way out now. No turning back. Evelyn stood up, her movements sharp like a predator closing in on its prey. "We trusted you," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "And now look where we are." Ryan took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his jacket pocket where a small silver flask rested. But before he could take a drink, Diane lunged at him. Her palm connected with his chest, pushing him back hard, causing him to stumble and almost fall. The anger in her eyes was unmistakable. She wasn't used to being defied. "This was your doing," she spat. "You played us both, and now we have to deal with the mess you've created." Ryan took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his jacket pocket where a small silver flask rested. But before he could take a drink, Diane lunged at him. Her palm connected with his chest, pushing him back hard, causing him to stumble and almost fall. The anger in her eyes was unmistakable. She wasn't used to being defied. "This was your doing," she spat. "You played us both, and now we have to deal with the mess you've created." But before he could finish, Evelyn moved faster than Ryan had anticipated, pulling a gun from the back of her waistband. It was quick, too quick. Before Ryan could react, there was a deafening shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the room, reverberating off the glass windows and leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Ryan dropped to the floor, a pool of blood quickly forming beneath him as his life drained away in the space of a few seconds. The women stood frozen, staring at the body of the man they had both loved, betrayed, and now murdered. The room was cold, the only sound the distant hum of the city below, as the gravity of what had just happened settled in. Diane and Evelyn exchanged a glance, a look of realization passing between them. "We have to get rid of the body," Diane said, her voice trembling for the first time. But Evelyn, ever the strategist, was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Not yet," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to think carefully. One wrong move and everything we've built will fall apart." The game had changed, and there was no turning back now. San Francisco had always been a city of contrasts. The wealthy glittered in their high-rise condos, their faces bathed in the soft glow of the bay's fog, while just below, the shadows of the Tenderloin district whispered tales of broken dreams. For Ryan, a 20-year-old with an effortless charm, the city was a playground, one that promised both excitement and danger in equal measure. Ryan had never truly belonged anywhere. Born into a lower-middle-class family in a quiet suburb, he had learned early how to slip through the cracks. His parents, good people but not well-connected, couldn't offer him the opportunities he desired. So he made his own way, using his looks, his charisma, and his ability to read people like an open book. The truth was, Ryan wasn't just playing a game, he was surviving, and he did so by bending the rules. His first encounter with Diane was at an exclusive charity gala, one of those events where the rich and famous flaunted their wealth for a good cause, at least on the surface. Ryan had come with no intention other than to blend in, charm his way into a world that was far beyond his reach. Diane had been there, perched on a high chair at a VIP table, her presence commanding. She was everything Ryan imagined an affluent woman to be, polished, calculated, and a little cold. Her platinum blonde hair shimmered under the chandelier lights, and her emerald green dress clung to her statuesque frame. But beneath the surface, there was a longing in her eyes, a hunger for something more. Ryan had noticed her instantly, as he did with all women, but this one was different. She wasn't just beautiful, she was powerful. Diane Malone didn't need a man, but that, to Ryan, was exactly what made her the perfect target. He spent the evening positioning himself near her, never too forward but always present, always within her peripheral vision. At the perfect moment he struck. "Beautiful night," he had said, approaching her with that devil-may-care smile, the one that had broken countless hearts. Diane had glanced up, sizing him up. There was something about him that intrigued her. His dark eyes, sharp jawline, and easy smile were disarming. He was a breath of fresh air among the stuffy men who surrounded her. But it wasn't just his looks. There was a confidence, an ease in the way he moved that caught her attention. "It is," she replied, her voice smooth, but there was a coolness to it. She wasn't one to indulge in idle conversation with strangers. "Do I know you?" "No," Ryan replied, his voice like velvet, "but you will." That was how it started. With those words, Ryan began weaving his way into her life. At first it was harmless. He showed up at more events, always where she was, always with the same disarming smile and easy charm. He complimented her on her achievements, subtly flattering her in a way no one else did. Diane, used to men fawning over her wealth or her beauty, found herself drawn to the way Ryan seemed to see her for something more than just the polished exterior. She hadn't realized until then how lonely she had become. Diane was successful, yes, but her life had become a constant balancing act of power plays and responsibilities. She had long since shed the illusion of romance in her life. But with Ryan, there was an excitement she hadn't felt in years. He filled the void, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of attention that made her feel seen. That was how it started. With those words, Ryan began weaving his way into her life. At first, it was harmless. He showed up at more events, always where she was, always with the same disarming smile and easy charm. He complimented her on her achievements, subtly flattering her in a way no one else did. Diane, used to men fawning over her wealth or her beauty, found herself drawn to the way Ryan seemed to see her for something more than just the polished exterior. She hadn't realized until then how lonely she had become. Diane was successful, yes, but her life had become a constant balancing act of power plays and responsibilities. She had long since shed the illusion of romance in her life. But with Ryan, there was an excitement she hadn't felt in years. He filled the void, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of attention that made her feel seen. She met him at an exclusive charity dinner. He was sitting at the bar, looking out of place among the powerful CEOs and their young trophy wives. His eyes caught hers from across the room, and he held her gaze for just a moment too long. Evelyn wasn't used to men looking at her like that. She was used to being admired from a distance, respected. But Ryan saw her as something more than a title or a name. He saw her as a woman, and that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. At first, she had been cautious. Her mind, always analytical, scanned his motives. He wasn't wealthy, and yet he seemed to understand her world, the subtle game of power and influence. They talked, first about trivial things, art, music, politics, but their conversations quickly deepened. Ryan didn't shy away from discussing things that mattered to him, things that rattled her, and she found herself drawn to him. But the more she got to know him, the more Evelyn realized how much Ryan enjoyed playing both sides. He had no loyalty to anyone, only to his own survival. She didn't mind at first. In a way, she admired his ruthlessness. He reminded her of herself when she was younger, when she had clawed her way to the top, unafraid of stepping on others to get there. Soon, Diane and Evelyn's worlds collided. Diane, once aware of Evelyn's business success, had been intrigued by her presence at social events, but when they both realized they were involved with Ryan, things began to change. At first, it was a shared secret, one they didn't acknowledge out loud. But the tension between them built slowly, like the rising tide before a storm. Each woman, in her own way, was aware of the other, but Ryan had kept them both in the dark about the other's existence, playing them against each other with skillful manipulation. When Evelyn discovered Diane's involvement with Ryan, she was furious, not because of the affair, but because she had been made a fool of. She confronted Diane one evening, her face a mask of anger, her voice calm but filled with venom. "You think you can just take everything from me?" Evelyn hissed. "I'll make sure you regret this." Diane, in her usual controlled fashion, had responded with a smile. "I wasn't aware you owned him, Evelyn. I thought he was a free agent." But beneath the icy exterior, something shifted in both women. The game had changed. What had once been a matter of indulgence, of passion and excitement, had now become a battle of egos, a battle neither of them were prepared to lose. Ryan, at the center of it all, could only smile to himself. What he didn't know, what neither of the women realized, was that he had pushed them both too far. And now there was no way out. The cold light of dawn crept through the towering windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the opulent space. The silence that enveloped the apartment was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of silence that spoke of peace or tranquility, but rather of something darker, something irreversible. In the corner, near the window where Diane had stood hours ago, the remnants of Ryan's life lay discarded. His blood stained the polished marble floor, a grotesque contrast to the sleek luxury of the room. The sharp scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air, heavy and metallic. Diane Malone stood in front of the window now, her hands gripping the polished glass as she stared out over the city she had conquered. Her reflection was ghostly, the cold light highlighting the lines of age that had started to etch themselves into her face over the years. She was no longer the youthful woman who had walked into this city with nothing but ambition. Diane had built herself into something powerful, something feared. And yet, as she gazed out at the distant skyline, she could feel her empire crumbling. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her chest. Evelyn Wells sat across the room, her sharp eyes narrowed, her posture as stiff as always. Her hand, once firm and decisive, now trembled slightly as she cradled a glass of red wine. She had poured herself a second one, the first having been drained almost immediately after the shot rang out the night before. Despite her age, despite the years spent commanding respect in boardrooms and deal negotiations, there was something primal about Evelyn now, something that made her tremble in a way she had never allowed herself to before. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was loaded, thick with guilt, fear, and an undeniable sense of disbelief. They had killed him. They had murdered Ryan. The realization of it still hadn't fully sunk in. At times, it felt like a bad dream, a dream that they couldn't wake up from. But the cold reality was that Ryan was dead, and their lives, once so carefully controlled and orchestrated, were now spiraling into chaos. Finally, it was Diane who broke the silence. "We should have never gotten involved with him," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. Her eyes remained locked on the horizon, the city stretching out before her like a landscape of possibilities, even as she knew that she had just erased any chance of a future. Evelyn took a sip of wine, the glass shaking slightly in her hand as she stared at Diane, her face hard. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her voice sharp with bitterness. "But you didn't force me into this. I made my own choice, just as you did. Don't act like you're the only one who's paying the price." Diane turned to face her, her eyes cold. "I'm not saying that. But you—" She cut herself off, the words hanging between them, as if she were struggling to find the right way to articulate what had happened. "You were always in control, always the one with the power." Evelyn's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Power is an illusion, Diane. You should know that by now." The words stung. Diane had spent years building her empire, acquiring power, wealth, and influence. But here she was, standing in the ruins of her own choices, unable to do anything to repair the damage. She had once prided herself on her ability to navigate any situation, to always come out on top. Yet, in this moment, she felt completely helpless. "I never thought it would come to this," Diane whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor, where Ryan's blood still lingered in dark pools, as if mocking her. "I never thought I'd be capable of something like this." Evelyn's face softened, if only slightly. "None of us did," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. "But you can't change what's been done. The only thing left is to decide what comes next." The words hung heavy in the air. Neither of them had a clear answer. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. But one thing was certain. Ryan's death would not go unnoticed. Someone would eventually ask questions. Someone would eventually come looking for him. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. It echoed through the penthouse, a stark reminder of the world outside, the world that would soon demand answers. Diane's heart skipped a beat. She exchanged a look with Evelyn, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Was it the police? Had someone found the body already? Her mind raced with possibilities, most of them terrifying. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable, but she rose from her chair with surprising grace for a woman her age. She walked toward the door, her movements deliberate. Diane followed her, her mind still whirling as she tried to gather her thoughts. When Evelyn opened the door, a man stood there, a tall, clean-cut man in his mid-30s. His suit was immaculate, his dark hair combed back with meticulous precision. There was an air of authority about him, but no badge, no uniform. Just a quiet, controlled presence. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes flickering between Diane and Evelyn as if assessing the situation. It was then that Diane realized who he was. A private investigator. One of the best in the city, someone hired to find out what had happened to Ryan. "I'm here about Ryan," the man said, his voice low and even. "I need to ask you both a few questions." The room seemed to grow colder as the words settled over them. Diane could feel the walls closing in. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either collapse or be swept under the rug. Evelyn straightened, her lips forming a tight line. She stepped forward, her eyes steely. "You've been hired by the wrong people," she said, her tone icy. "You won't find what you're looking for here." The investigator's eyes didn't waver. He hadn't moved an inch. "I'm not here to play games. Just tell me where he is and we can move on. No one else needs to get hurt." Diane held her breath. She felt the weight of the lie forming on her lips, but the truth, the crushing weight of what they had done, was threatening to suffocate her. For a moment, she felt like she might break. But Evelyn, as always, was the one in control. She met the investigator's gaze without flinching. "He's gone," she said flatly, "and we don't know where he is." The investigator seemed to study her for a moment longer, as if trying to gauge whether she was lying. But after a beat, he nodded once, curtly. "I'll be in touch," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the two women standing in the doorway. As the sound of his footsteps faded, Diane let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension in her body loosened, but only slightly. There was no going back now. They had both crossed a line, and the aftermath was just beginning. The morning of the murder felt like any other day, at least on the surface. The sun had risen over the bay, casting a warm, golden glow across the city, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The kind of tension that wraps around your throat, tightens your chest, and weighs heavily on your every step. Diane Malone could feel it as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her makeup with practiced precision. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm exterior she tried so hard to maintain. She wasn't just getting ready for another day in her meticulously ordered life. She was preparing for something much darker, something she couldn't quite control. She stared at her reflection, the woman in the mirror a stranger to her now. The platinum blonde hair, the sharp cheekbones, the cold, calculating eyes, they were all part of the mask she had worn for years. But today, beneath it all, something was unraveling. Diane had never imagined she would be capable of what was about to happen, never imagined she would lose herself so completely. Yet here she was, just a breath away from crossing the final line that would sever any chance of redemption. The morning of the murder felt like any other day, at least on the surface. The sun had risen over the bay, casting a warm, golden glow across the city, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The kind of tension that wraps around your throat, tightens your chest, and weighs heavily on your every step. Diane Malone could feel it as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her makeup with practiced precision. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm exterior she tried so hard to maintain. She wasn't just getting ready for another day in her meticulously ordered life. She was preparing for something much darker, something she couldn't quite control. She stared at her reflection, the woman in the mirror a stranger to her now. The platinum blonde hair, the sharp cheekbones, the cold, calculating eyes, they were all part of the mask she had worn for years. But today, beneath it all, something was unraveling. Diane had never imagined she would be capable of what was about to happen, never imagined she would lose herself so completely. Yet here she was, just a breath away from crossing the final line that would sever any chance of redemption. Ryan was coming. He had called earlier that morning, as he always did before arriving at Diane's place. His tone had been light, almost playful, as if nothing had changed between them. He had no idea that this would be the last time he ever spoke to either of them. "You sound distant," Ryan had said, his voice coming through the phone, his words laced with an odd cheerfulness. "What's going on? You're not having second thoughts, are you?" The question hung in the air between them as Diane pressed the phone against her ear. There was a pause before she answered, her voice betraying nothing. "No second thoughts," she replied, her words cold and measured. "You'll be here soon?" "I'm on my way. I'll be there in an hour," Ryan responded, the sound of traffic in the background as he navigated through the streets of the city. Diane hadn't told him she already knew, that she already knew everything about him, about the lies he had told both of them, the way he had played them against each other, like pawns in a game he never intended to lose. Evelyn hadn't said much to her since the phone call, but when Diane entered the kitchen, she saw the older woman's eyes flicker with something darker than the usual indifference. Evelyn's mind was already racing, calculating every possible outcome. "He'll be here soon," Diane said, her voice quieter now, tinged with something that bordered on fear. She had no idea how she was going to handle it, how she would go through with it. Evelyn looked up at her, the same sharpness in her gaze, but now there was a hint of something else. Sympathy? Perhaps, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by a mask of indifference. "We're past the point of backing out," Evelyn said, her voice low but steady. "Don't let him get to you now. He's just a distraction." Diane nodded, though her stomach churned. She wasn't so sure. Ryan had never been just a distraction. He had been a force in her life, pulling her into his web of lies and manipulation. And now, he would be the one who would make her face the consequences of their shared decisions. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence that had settled over them like a thick fog. Diane's heart raced in her chest, each beat feeling louder than the last. She exchanged one last glance with Evelyn before walking toward the door. Ryan stood in the hallway when she opened it, his usual cocky grin stretched across his face. He was dressed casually in a fitted black jacket and jeans, looking every bit the young man who had so effortlessly slid into their lives. His dark hair was messily styled, and his eyes, those dark eyes that had always seemed to see straight through her, sparkled with the thrill of their forbidden rendezvous. "Good to see you, gorgeous," Ryan said, his voice smooth, his smile unshaken. Diane's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to smile, holding her composure. "You're late," she said, her tone even. Ryan stepped into the apartment, brushing past her with a nonchalant swagger. He didn't notice the coldness in her eyes or the subtle tension in the air. He was oblivious, as always, wrapped up in his own little world, confident that nothing would ever go wrong for him. "I had to take care of some things," he said, as if it were nothing. "But I'm here now. We can get started, right?" Diane's mind raced. This was it, the moment everything would change. Her hand trembled as she closed the door behind him, the sound of the lock clicking in place almost deafening. "I'll get us something to drink," Diane said, her voice steady despite the hurricane of thoughts and emotions that swirled within her. She turned toward the bar, gathering her composure, her back to Ryan. Evelyn, who had been watching the exchange from the hallway, now stepped into the living room, her presence imposing. Ryan turned toward her, raising an eyebrow in surprise but offering her the same smile. Well, I see you've both decided to play nice today," he said, the words dripping with mockery. Evelyn's gaze remained cool and unreadable. Don't flatter yourself, Ryan. We're just here to have a conversation. Ryan chuckled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. He hadn't realized yet that this wasn't going to be just another casual meeting. He hadn't realized yet that they had both grown tired of playing his game. Diane turned back to face him, holding 2 glasses of scotch. She placed one on the table in front of him, her fingers brushing against his as she did. The touch was cold, controlled. "I think it's time we have that conversation," she said, her voice soft but cutting through the tension like a blade. Ryan stared at her for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he tried to read her. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to make of her, and that unnerved him. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone shifting. "You're acting strange, both of you." Diane didn't answer right away. She simply watched him, her gaze unflinching. And then, as if on cue, Evelyn moved closer, her presence looming over him. "You've played both of us long enough, Ryan," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "It ends today." Ryan's eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. Before he could react, Diane's hand shot forward, the cold metal of the gun pressing against his temple. His expression flickered between disbelief and anger, but there was no time for words, no time for anything but the inevitable. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the penthouse, sharp and final. And just like that, Ryan's life ended. The courtroom buzzed with muted whispers, a symphony of speculation and judgment. The polished wood paneling, the towering bench where the judge sat, and the relentless glare of fluorescent lights all made the room feel both solemn and suffocating. Diane sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the weight of months of legal battles etched into the deep lines on her face. She was a shadow of the confident, commanding woman who once ruled over her world with precision. Across the room, Evelyn sat at her own table, her gaze fixed forward, her expression as unreadable as ever. The trial had captured national attention. The penthouse murder was splashed across every tabloid, dissected by every true crime podcast, and debated on every news outlet. The narrative was too salacious to ignore: 2 wealthy women, a young lover, and a brutal murder. But beneath the sensationalism lay a far more complex story, one that Diane and Evelyn had spent weeks trying to control as it unraveled in front of them. As the judge entered, the room fell silent, the collective tension palpable. Diane's lawyer leaned in, whispering something to her, but she barely registered the words. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the choices that had led her here. Months earlier, after Ryan's murder, Diane and Evelyn had scrambled to cover their tracks. Evelyn had been the calm one, dictating the cleanup process with clinical efficiency. She had a plan for everything: disposing of the gun, wiping down surfaces, even planting evidence to mislead investigators. Diane, on the other hand, had been a mess, her emotions oscillating wildly between guilt and anger. The power dynamic between them had shifted. For the first time, Diane felt like a pawn in Evelyn's game. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how meticulously they're buried. A neighbor's security camera had captured Ryan entering the building that night and never leaving. Forensics teams had found traces of blood in places they hadn't thought to clean. And then there were the financial records, a tangled web of transactions that revealed just how entwined Ryan had been with both women. When the police came for Diane, she had been alone in her apartment, sipping a glass of wine and staring at the skyline. The knock on the door had been loud and unrelenting, and when she opened it to find 2 detectives standing there, their badges glinting in the dim light, she had known it was over. Evelyn's arrest came 2 days later. She had been at her country estate, hosting a charity luncheon when the officers arrived. Ever the composed socialite, she had smiled politely, excused herself from the table, and allowed herself to be taken away without a hint of resistance. But Diane knew better. Beneath Evelyn's mask of control lay a fury that would not be contained. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution began their closing arguments. The lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for being ruthless, paced in front of the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "This wasn't a crime of passion," she said, her gaze sweeping over the 12 jurors. "This was a calculated act, carried out by two women who thought they could manipulate their way out of anything. They saw Ryan not as a person, but as a tool, a means to an end. And when he became inconvenient, they disposed of him." Diane felt the eyes of the jury on her, their judgment heavy in the air. She wanted to scream, to explain that it wasn't that simple, that Ryan had played them against each other, that he had his own secrets, his own manipulations. But her lawyer had warned her against speaking. "Let the evidence speak for itself," he had said. But what evidence? The truth was as tangled as the lies they had told to hide it. Evelyn, meanwhile, remained stoic, her gaze never wavering. She had testified earlier in the trial, painting herself as a victim of Ryan's schemes and Diane's instability. She had always been good at spinning narratives, at making people see what she wanted them to see. But Diane knew the truth. Evelyn had been just as complicit, just as ruthless. The verdict came 2 days later. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Diane sat with her heart pounding, her hands gripping the edge of the table as the jury filed back into the room. The foreman stood, a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Diane Reynolds, guilty of second-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Diane's vision blurred, her mind struggling to process the words. She barely heard the rest of the verdicts. Evelyn, too, was found guilty, but of a lesser charge, manslaughter. Her lawyers had successfully argued that she had acted under duress, manipulated by Diane into participating in the crime. As the judge read out the sentences, Diane felt a strange sense of detachment. 15 years in prison. Evelyn received 10. It was almost laughable, the way Evelyn had managed to come out ahead once again. Even now, in their downfall, she had found a way to win. Months later, Diane sat in her prison cell, staring at the cracked paint on the walls. She had lost everything, her freedom, her wealth, her carefully constructed life. But in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to think about it, she realized that what hurt most wasn't the loss of her freedom. It was the betrayal. Evelyn had been more than a partner in crime. She had been someone Diane thought she could trust. But in the end, Evelyn had looked out for herself, just as Ryan had. Evelyn, meanwhile, was adjusting to her own new reality. Her reduced sentence meant she had privileges Diane could only dream of: access to books, better meals, even occasional visits from old friends who still believed in her innocence. But beneath her composed exterior, Evelyn knew she would never escape the stain of what she had done. Ryan's face haunted her dreams, a constant reminder of the choices she had made. In the end, their story became a cautionary tale, a twisted saga of love, greed, and betrayal that captivated the nation but left destruction in its wake. For Diane and Evelyn, there was no redemption, no happy ending, only the cold, hard reality of the choices they had made and the lives they had ruined in the process. And as they each faced their futures alone, they were forced to confront the truth they had spent so long denying. They were their own worst enemies.